Okay, well, we're now official. Welcome everyone to the fourth meeting of the advisory committee for ADUs in Denver. And it's hard to believe it's already June. So as people are joining, and we'll ask folks to, please rename themselves in the Zoom, as most of you have done. I think what we're going to do tonight, like we did in May, is forego introductions. For most of us, folks know each other. We've got reminders in the Zoom about who's who. I think I will ask the council members to introduce themselves. I see we have Councilwoman Black. I don't know if Councilman Herndon's joining us tonight, but it would be wonderful for you all to introduce yourselves, elected officials, and then we'll do I just have a quick question for everybody before we jump into tonight's meeting. Anyway, go ahead, Councilwoman Black.
All right, welcome everyone. I'm Kendra Black. I see my neighbor Mary. Hi, Mary. Thanks for doing this. It's an important discussion, and I think the meetings have been really great. So thank you everyone for participating. Oh, and hello, Darcy. Long time no see. Well, all of you. I can't say hello to every one of you, but I know most of you, so hello.
Thank you so much. I don't see Councilman Herndon unless I am missing you. So I think with that, before we jump into tonight's meeting, here's one quick question, and this will give us another minute for latecomers. The best thing that's happened in June so far. So it's June 9th. You've had a little over a week. Put it in the chat, say it verbally, whichever you prefer, but the best thing so far in June. I assume for some of you like me, it will be, my son is a huge Colorado Avalanche fan. That's one great thing. So here we go. Best. I'm going to put the question in the chat. Oh my gosh, the best it's ever been, your garden, Ozzy. Amazing. And warmer weather, and now it's going to get into like the 90s and 100s. Hopefully not that much, but careful what we wish for. Anything else? Great things in June, National Home Ownership Month. Excellent. Hummingbirds in the garden, a surprise birthday trip. Jenny, do you know what it is yet? I mean, has it happened or it's not?
No, it hasn't. So it's the next week. So it hasn't happened yet, but the fact that he planned something and has kept it a surprise is like a record in 25 years of knowing him. He's never been able to keep a surprise before. So I'm excited about the trip and the surprise part.
Oh my God. Congratulations to him for doing that.
Exactly.
Never too late.
Oh man. Okay. Well, this is making me happy. Thank you. Thank you for indulging me in the best parts of June so far. So tonight's meeting, as all of you probably remember, in April and May, we spent 2 months really identifying key issues and constraints that all of you, members of the public, are experiencing and see with respect to building ADUs in Denver. And in particular, May was really focused on the different neighborhood contexts and how those issues vary across neighborhood context. Tonight and at our next meeting, we're transitioning to thinking about, okay, what do we do about those issues? And so staff has taken a really hard look at all of your input. There's been a public survey, which you're going to hear from both Abe and Libby about in terms of what we've heard thus far. And the staff has put together some initial ideas. So tonight we're talking about hearing about those initial ideas, getting your high level responses to those. We're not going to spend a ton of time on each one, but we want to take your temperature on them, get your initial responses. And then staff between this meeting and the next meeting will be refining those ideas and proposals with a bit more detail and specificity, and coming back at the next meeting for you all to look at those and have greater discussion. So tonight is really about hearing from you on these initial ideas. So that's sort of our overall purpose, and just a reminder in terms of how this will work. Everyone can raise your hand physically or on the Zoom chat when you're ready to to say something. Please feel free to use the chat, but like last time, we're going to try to keep the chat just to quick and clarifying questions. Any really substantive things, we're going to ask people to share verbally. Reminder for members of the public who are participating that there is an active question and answer section, and you're welcome to participate in that. We always include that conversation in writing in the meeting summary at the end of the meeting summaries, and all of those are on the city's webpage if you go to ADUs in Denver. Also, Libby is going to be monitoring that Q&A page, and will periodically, I'll turn to her to see if there's questions to funnel back to the committee in their discussion tonight. We also will take 5 minutes at the very end if people have remaining public comments that haven't been addressed through the meeting. We'll come to you then. So please be thinking toward the end of the meeting if you want to raise your hand for public comment. And so with that, I think just a quick introduction to to the agenda. You all have seen it generally, but the idea is that after a quick recap from Abe and Libby on what's been heard so far, we're going to turn to Josh. He's going to just quickly frame kind of a proposed idea for each of one of six different issues, which he'll summarize for you at the beginning. And then we'll just turn to you all to get your high level input on those ideas. If we need more time, we will certainly schedule additional time in July for topics. So with that, I think that's all I had. Are there any high level questions or additional comments from staff before we turn to Abe first?
I don't think so. I think that was a good intro.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So Abe, I think you were going to start off on a recap for everybody.
Yeah, thanks. So if you advance to the next slide, unlike usual, hopefully I'll only be talking for a couple of minutes here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Libby. But as you'll remember, we looked at a lot of models at the last meeting to help understand existing zoning regulations. Josh had all those great models kind of walking through why things happen the way they do now, as well as what can currently be built in terms of just new infill in general and ADUs in particular in different neighborhood contexts around the city. Didn't have enough time for deep discussion around most of the models, so we'll be returning to some of that primarily at the next meeting. But we did get some interesting feedback. Overall, definitely heard loud and clear we should be looking, more at ground level or street level views, including views from backyards and alleys to kind of understand that. We're going to have more of that at the next meeting. And then just also in general, yes, context matters. So for example, in the urban context where you have larger two-story structures and it's possible to position even a two-story ADU, there's a two-story ADU hiding behind that picture on the left. And not surprisingly, your activity answers to, whether the location is right, whether the size is appropriate, whether the height fits in, we're all pretty positive. A little more circumspect about the context, like in a urban edge, which would tend to have more one-story structures, and especially when there's like a one-story primary structure and a two-story ADU, about whether it really is the right combination, and what's happening when you're on a corner lot and the ADU might be facing the side street. So you can go on to the next slide. A couple more pictures to look at. And so here, just on the left, that was a question about the suburban context, and apologies, it's not street level, it's kind of the bird's eye view again, but that's the view we use. We'll try to move away from that. And in a lot of the questions we asked about the suburban neighborhood context, there was some interest in talking about, I think, the location. And if you look at the model on the right, the height, like when we asked about one-story things, got a much more positive response in more suburban context than two-story things. And then just one last slide for me, the next one. we asked some more general questions, non-visual. One of the ones we asked was about the ownership of ADUs. We're probably not going to have time to really talk about that today, but we want to talk about that more. It'll probably be at the next meeting. We did ask about short-term rentals and kind of put out the scenario about how many there really are happening in ADUs right now and why people are doing it. Based on that, the majority of the participants felt like that moving forward, we should probably just assume that the short-term rentals overall citywide and as they apply to ADUs should stay the same. There were, some responses that we should continue to talk about them. I think, our plan at this moment is to set the topic aside until we hear more from the general public. So we don't plan to talk about it more today or necessarily even at the next meeting while we just see what we hear in the more public forums, just to keep you up to date on that. And then we also have the public survey that Libby is going to describe some of the results that we've heard so far.
Thanks, Abe. So we kicked off a public survey in early May, and we just closed it late last week. And we had about 377 people who responded to the survey, which gave us some additional insight into issues regarding ADUs. And so first off, we asked folks what concerns they would have if their neighbor built an ADU. And we allowed them to check off a list of common concerns. And privacy, ADU design, and parking were the top 3 concerns, followed by access to sunlight and overcrowding. We also allowed people to provide other concerns they would have, and 15 did mention short-term rentals or Airbnbs. Some also mentioned the impact of increased density and were concerned at this stressing the existing infrastructure. As we've mentioned previously, we don't intend to add a parking requirement for ADUs as none exist today. And as Abe mentioned, we also don't intend to create any new regulations for short-term rentals that would differ from the primary house. And then I did also want to note that 21% of folks said that they would have no concerns if their neighbor built an ADU, with one person noting that they're most concerned about getting people into housing. Next, thanks. In the survey, we also mentioned that we're considering tailoring the ADU standards according to the neighborhood context. And we asked if people had concerns regarding that approach. Several said it made sense to have differing standards for urban versus suburban lots, with many noting that the ADU standards regarding such things as height and setbacks could vary based on characteristics like the neighborhood context, the lot size, and whether or not there were alleys. In contrast, a few people did say that we should just keep the rules as is with their one-size-fits-all approach, which might be easier to understand overall. And then one of the issues that we've discussed with you all previously is that ADUs are not allowed on lots that don't meet the minimum lot size specified for a particular zone district. And we asked survey respondents if they thought we should remove this requirement. And 55% said that they strongly or somewhat agree with removing the minimum lot size requirement, while 37% strongly or somewhat disagree. Those who disagreed said that removing the lot size requirement would contribute to overcrowding and a loss of permeability and open space. And one person provided a fairly colorful quote and asked, how does it make any sense to allow an additional unit on a lot that is already the size of a postage stamp? It's just more cram and density in already dense neighborhoods. More effort needs to be put into adding density to historically larger lots, not smaller lots. And yet this is a little, I'll just make one more comment on that. That's a little interesting because we heard from several survey respondents that ADUs shouldn't be allowed in suburban neighborhoods where larger lots are typical. So we've certainly heard from both ends of the spectrum. And then we also asked people if they thought that the 1.5 story height limitation was a barrier to ADU construction, and 49% agreed versus 32% disagreeing, while 20% were neutral. So combined with what we've heard from you all, we'll definitely explore some alternatives to this 1.5 story limitation. And then the last survey data I'll present pertains to how people would approach building their own ADU. And 40% would like to convert an existing detached structure like a garage into an ADU, while 50% said that they would build a new detached structure. And then somewhat contrary to the interest that we've gotten from the public, another 30% said that they would do an attached ADU by either converting space in their home or creating an addition to their home. And then the remainder of folks said that they would like to build above or next to an existing garage. And another follow-up question to this, we also heard from 73% of people who said that this project should make it easier to reuse an existing structure. So you can certainly expect us to propose some potential solutions to this reuse issue as the project progresses. And with that, I'll turn it over to Josh.
And Libby, and thanks, Libby, and Josh, maybe before you transition into proposed approaches for tonight, I just wonder if we have a couple minutes, and if anyone has any comments or takeaways or questions from any of this data you just heard.
For the demographics of the data collected from the public survey, do you have those demographics? Like especially for, I would say maybe like AMI, because was this provided in other languages for people who don't speak English but are still homeowners or renters, things of that nature, to truly better understand like where this data is coming from? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, thanks. Great questions. Yeah, definitely. We have the demographic data, and it's still pretty fresh. So we're still going through a lot of the information, but the survey was available in Spanish. And for now, it is trending wealthier and whiter as these surveys tend to do. But yeah, we're still going through some of that information and looking at a little bit more targeted outreach for those demographics we didn't quite hit in the future.
Thanks for the question, Emily.
Thank you.
Josh, is the survey still open?
It's not open. We did close it towards the
Okay.
beginning of the month.
Okay. Any final questions or comments before we move on?
I just had a question. As far as like other surveys that the city has done, the response that you've gotten, is this like about average of what you see? Like or is it kind of on the lower end? Just kind of curious on how we feel on the number of responses.
Yeah, I would say it's slightly above average. I mean, I was surprised that we got nearly 400 respondents. What do you think, Abe? You have more experience with these processes?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes with a really controversial project, that it usually would be in a later phase than this, where a proposal has been put on the table. Yeah, it'll be thousands, but for an early phase survey, we're lucky if we get 100 responses. So yeah, I think we feel pretty good.
Yeah, and I suppose that could say a number of things, but it certainly points to engagement and interest. Gabe, you had your hand up for a minute. Did you want to?
I did, but Josh mentioned that there were like 400 respondents, and that's what I was kind of curious about.
Perfect. Any other final question? Oh, Rosemary, yeah, go ahead.
I just have a question. How was the survey distributed? Was it distributed to RNOs? Was it just on the ADUs in Denver website, or how was it available to just anybody to fill it out? I don't remember where I saw it personally.
It was, yeah, I went through our general CPD newsletter. So it did go to RNOs, noticing in that regard. We also have a bunch of just kind of social media blasts that our communications team has put out. And so any of those typical sort of networks that we use for noticing.
Okay, Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Brooke, how about one last question, and then we will move to the heart of the meeting. Go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, Libby had noted that the staff were surprised by the amount of responses that were interested in converting or building an attached ADU. I was wondering if the staff could maybe explain why that was surprising compared to previous information that you've garnered.
I think people don't ask us about attached ADUs very much. So nor do we get a ton of permit requests for them. But perhaps that's because they're a little easier to build without permits, like illegally. But yeah, I think so. Just seeing the level of interest there was an opportunity for us to see that people are thinking about it, which is great.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, right? People want to use the building that already exists, but they often find that there's a lot more hurdles to that. And so we don't see as many permits for them. We don't see that many of them built or reused, unfortunately, but it points to the need for us to address it in this project. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for the great questions. All right, so at this point, I think you can move the slide, Josh, to the summary of what we're going to talk about now. And just a quick reminder before Josh lunges in that the format for the next hour and 20 minutes or so is to hear from Josh on each of these topics, just to frame what the city has heard so far, what they're thinking about as staff, and then turn to you all to have 5 or 10 minutes of discussion for each one at a high level. You know, what concerns do you have? Anything that's missing? And hopefully most of these will resonate for you because they reflect the input heard so far. And then again, at the next meeting, we're going to get into much more detail. You'll actually be able to look at some draft language based on your input and make edits then and suggestions. So I think with that, again, we'll please note your thoughts and comments, and then we'll open it up for discussion related to each one with a few questions for you all. Go ahead, Josh. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ryan. Yeah, so let's jump into it. The meat of the meeting here, we want to really open it up and have more of a dialogue with you guys. We presented a lot of information last time, and so we're hoping to do less of that and have more of a discussion, but we do have some ideas, some potential proposals to where we're leaning. But first, we wanted to tackle some really big ticket items. We think these first sort of 6 questions, proposals that we have will really have some of the greatest impact as far as removing barriers. And a lot of these things will kind of inform some of the other decisions that we'll have to make later down the line. So as we progress. So first, we want to look at the minimum lot size discussion. We know that that's a big one. Heightened stories is mentioned through the survey results and through your input. Looking at bulk plane height, see if we need some work there. Building coverage exemption, we've talked a lot about the parking and housing cars over housing people. We also want to look closely at setbacks, the privacy issue and sunlight and things like that that are coming up as concerns. And finally, this idea of reusing existing structures. In the later meetings, we will get to the ideas of owner occupancy, looking a little bit more closely at those suburban contexts and what should be done there. And of course, looking at the ADUs with other uses and higher intensity districts. But we think starting off with these, 6 big ticket items will help us work our way through some of those latter decisions. So with that, we'll start off with the minimum lot size. So you might remember previously we talked about how many of Denver's lot sizes don't quite meet the minimum requirement, even though they might be zoned for an ADU. We've heard from you, the committee, that a lot of folks have confirmed that, yes, we realize this is an issue. The rules feel slightly inequitable. The threshold is a bit arbitrary, like we just kind of picked out a number. And if you're 1 foot, 2 feet on the either side of that number, it doesn't really work out. And so we want to look at if that makes sense. It is possible to go through a variance process for some folks if your lot size is close enough, but that just adds time and money and delays to a housing unit that could come online. And also this idea that ADUs are size limited and they are proportionate to their size. We do have rules around lot coverage but also the threshold of the size of ADU you can build based on your lot size. And so we wouldn't be increasing any of those things through this necessarily. We would just be looking at what the lot size removal would do. I mentioned previously the example of the Sloan Lake neighborhood, where it was 1,500 parcels, about 500 couldn't meet that minimum. And so 30% of the neighborhood was basically ineligible. We started to look at that a little bit deeper. So looking at the info citywide, this is basically every lot size broken down, single unit, but also 2 units. So we have roughly 102,000 single unit parcels, and about 14% of the city's zone lots, properties would not meet that standard, would not meet the minimum to allow a detached ADU. Those numbers really get out of control if you look at 2 units. So if you're in a 2-unit district, but living in a single unit building and you wanted to add an ADU, you basically have a 50% chance of meeting that minimum lot size or not. And so we think looking closely at this standard, if we were to just remove the minimum lot size citywide, we could essentially open up about 21,000 parcels that are currently ineligible for detached accessory dwelling units. You can see here, just looking at one line, like the SUD, the D lot size is our basically average Denver lot size, 6,250. It's about 50% of all of our single unit lots, and only about 6% of them citywide would meet that threshold. But it really takes effect on some of the smaller lots, like our B and C lots, where 30% or 26% citywide would not meet that minimum. So we'd like to really ask the question of this committee: should we just go for it? Should we just remove the minimum lot size requirement entirely, knowing that ADUs do have some limits and proportions already related to their lot size? Or should we look at just picking another number and another arbitrary number somewhere below these ranges and putting it in place? So we'd like to open it up for discussion. We'd like to know if there's some blind spots that we're missing, if there are any unintended consequences of just simply removing this standard. And what major concerns would you guys have, knowing that we just heard a little bit from the public survey? So keep that in mind, that the public has opinions on what this means, but what do we think?
Thanks, Josh. So let's open it up. I see a question from Ozzy in the chat, and Councilwoman Black you have your hand up. So why don't you go ahead? There's also a question from Gosha in the chat. So if these are easily answered in the chat, great. But Councilwoman Black, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I need you to explain this to me because I'm not clear on it. So if you go back to the previous slide,
Yep,
where it showed like SUI, so those are really large lots. And the minimum lot size, is that the minimum lot size to be in that zone district, or that's the minimum lot size you need to build an ADU in that district?
this is for an ADU, but it's typically aligned to the minimum lot size generally. So yeah, it'd be 12,000 square feet.
Okay, so I'm just picking the larger lots because that's my district, but
Yeah.
if you were in SUI and you had an 11,000 square foot lot, you could not build an ADU.
Yeah, that's the pattern that's set up today. I mean, it's tricky.
Okay, so that doesn't make sense because that's a huge lot, relatively speaking.
Correct.
So the person who commented when Libby was reading the comments, who said, why would we cram them into small lots? We should put them on big lots. I think this is perfectly demonstrates that this isn't really logical. That I'm not speaking to the smaller lots. I don't know where I am on that, but at least on the larger lots, this particular line, isn't logical.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a little tricky in the SU because, as you know, there's not a lot of suburban contexts that allow ADUs today, but the
Right.
SUF that does exist, it does follow the pattern of 8,500 square feet being that threshold. So if we were to, follow that same philosophy citywide, it would be
Right.
equivalent. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to note, like those minimum lot sizes, like doing what Josh has kind of put out there, wouldn't change anything about the creation of new lots. So in these districts that have a minimum lot size of 12,000 square feet, you couldn't split that into 2 lots. Still,
Oh,
it's just a
right.
question of whether you can build an ADU on it or not.
Right.
So I would say the smaller lots would be the ones that might be more concerning. So I would want to hear from people who live in neighborhoods with the smaller lots. And I mean, is that, you
Mhm.
still have to have setbacks and bulk planes and all that, right?
Oh, yeah,
So,
certainly.
Yeah,
So
I
I,
think
oh, go ahead.
yeah.
I see Sarah's hand went up and then Gabe's. So perhaps they want to build on that. Sarah, do you want to go ahead first?
Sure. Yeah, I think, I think removing this minimum lot size definitely makes sense. I think that we have so many different rules of measurement right now, as Councilwoman Black was just kind of talking about. We still have setbacks. We still have the lot coverage. So that is going to keep the size of these down, no matter whether it's a 3,000 square foot lot or if it's a 12,000 square foot lot. So I just think that anywhere where we can remove some of these barriers to have so many different rules of measurement, I think that this really, really makes sense. And some of those percentages of the amount of people that are affected by this is, it's a lot. It's a lot. You look at it, you're like, oh, great, I'm in USU B1 zoning, I can build an ADU. And then it's like, oh, shoot, my lot's only 4,400 square feet. You're 100 square feet short. And then kind of like Josh, you were talking about, to try to go in front of Board of Adjustment to get a variance for this, that a huge risk for any homeowner and very expensive, the way the process is to go through that right now. So I think that this is, to me, it's kind of a no-brainer of a requirement to remove. So yeah,
Thanks, Sarah. And there's some comments echoing what you're saying in the chat from Renee and Gosha as well. And Renee saying, remove the minimum lot size and rely on the setbacks in bulk plane to limit the size. Look at differentiating setbacks for being more flexible with 1 story than 2. Gabe, let's go to you, and the others may have comments, and then we'll, yeah.
Okay, yeah, just real quick, I do agree with Sarah and some of the things that she said about just removing the lot size, because you want to do it, if someone's going to create an ADU or an add-on, why not make sure that goes through the process with getting a permit and it's safe and everything else, versus someone trying to, go around all the rules.
Mhm.
The other thing too is the comment on the survey about the density. I mean, yes, it is going to cause more density, but then on the other hand, there'll be more, if we don't do it, there'll be more sprawl. People will just keep moving further out, and then you get more traffic. It's kind of, I think I heard an analogy on NPR where density is like a bus or a train where you can move a lot of people, in one unit, but sprawl causes everyone's cars to start, coming in and out of town too. So, I can see the person's comment on the density, but I don't think it's a terrible thing.
Mhm. Great, thanks, Gabe. And another comment from Ozzy too, and one from Lisa. Everyone seems to be both supportive and have thoughts about how to better address the issue. Rosemary, go ahead.
I really should know this, but I'm curious, some of the conservation overlays that were done in historic districts for ADUs, did some of that include the minimum lot size issue, or was it just the design of the ADU?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think they still follow the form standards that are here in the code. I think, yeah, they had some allowances for dormers and things like that. It's a little bit more design related, height and things like that, but not, I don't think any of them actually waived the lot size, besides maybe Curtis Park, maybe, I think might be the only one that has an exception, but it's a higher intensity zone district as well. It's row home.
Okay, thanks.
So I'm hearing a lot of support for this one, and I think we want to keep moving because the next one is about height and stories. I know there's been a lot of input on that, but does anyone have any final like red flags before we move on? And also know that you can put it in the chat. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, all good thoughts. And yeah, I think that idea that it is proportionate. So if your lot size is a postage stamp, that means your ADU can only be the size of a pinhead or something like that, right? Since it is tied proportionately. So we as staff agree that it kind of makes sense.
Wonderful. Thanks.
All right. Yeah. So looking at height and stories, we've talked a lot about the 1.5 story limitation. The idea that it sort of complicates design, complicates floor plans, layouts. The building technically, really does look and smell and feel like a 2-story building, but we're just kind of adding some nuance in there with the square footage. We've heard that it's kind of adding some unnecessary cost and a little bit of time to design, build, detail, and things like that. And so from you, the committee, we've heard clearly that it's confirmed an issue, possibly one of the greatest barriers for feasibility for economic ADU construction. It's getting in the way of some of those prefab, potentially construction innovation things that could come along with that, could help affordability, design, construction complications, and of course, the structural design implications that are associated with that. We've talked a lot about it in our last meeting as well, that, essentially your square footage gets cut down. You're allowed 650 square foot of an ADU on paper for our smallest lot sizes. And it's really difficult to get there. You can only get about 400 square feet of actual livable square footage once you kind of whittle down some of these restrictions. We want to ask the question if we're really adding a lot more work here. Are we adding more detailing, finishing, cornering, waterproofing? We're putting a lot of jogs and nuance onto these buildings. I mean, they're beautifully detailed and look great in the end, but all of these things come at a cost. Someone's out there cutting each one of these gutters and fitting them in place, and time is money, and detailing is the same. So we really want to ask the question. We think we've heard that 2 stories feels pretty appropriate in the urban context. And if we are taking this truly contextual approach throughout the city, the no-brainer approach would say, 2 stories urban, 1 story suburban, urban edge is 1.5. It falls right in between. But we're not sure if that really makes sense, if there's complication there as well. So we want to ask the question of the committee. Let's have the discussion. Does 2 stories, a full 2 stories, feel appropriate in the urban context? Should that apply to the urban edge context as well? And if suburban were to allow something like 1.5 stories, would it be possible if the setbacks were great enough or the placement was appropriate? And so let's open it up for that discussion.
Okay, great. And we can start either with urban edge or suburban, unless somebody wants to point out any concerns about the urban proposal. But maybe we'll discuss them sort of in clumps. So Councilwoman Black, go ahead. Thanks.
Well, I'm really dominating today.
You're good.
I'm very interested in limiting suburban to 1 story, but I don't feel like I can recommend that until we talk about other ways to deal with what I think is a privacy issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so this bullet point says something about substantial setbacks or placements, and I'd like to talk about that first.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just putting that out there. I know in like the University Hills neighborhood, for example, which is a little more dense than some other suburban neighborhoods, people are tearing down very small houses and building McMansions, which also tower over someone's backyard. And so I kind of want to look at that and think about that. I know you did that with some of the diagrams, but I feel like those setbacks for a McMansion, if they already exist, maybe there would be the same kind of setbacks or placement for an ADU. And then if you can build a 2-story giant house, why couldn't you build a 2-story ADU on, if it had those same setbacks? So,
Interesting. Yeah.
Good points.
So-
Yeah, we will look at that. We'll look at setbacks later on.
Yeah.
And
it-
just a
it sounds-
note,
Also, just for you, Councilwoman Black, that the setbacks and placement feels just more important in a way, or more relevant to the privacy issue that your constituents are most focused on, that you've heard about, than talking about stories. But so we can also loop back to this after having those other conversations. But Abe, sorry, go ahead. I think I interrupted you, and then I see Rosemary's hand is up too.
yeah, sorry. And I just wanted to point out that you could build an attached ADU as part of your quote unquote McMansion, because that would be following the same rules as the primary structure. So it could just be built in there. But I would be interested in what everybody else thinks about, like, well, maybe if 1 story is too restrictive in suburban for a detached ADU, which would be in the rear part of the lot, are there other rules that could make it okay? Greater setbacks, something about the bulk plane, whatever it is.
That's great. And that's the kind of nuance that I think that is really helpful for staff to hear from all of you as they sort of do the next iteration of thinking about this. So thank you, and really good points in the chat. Rosemary, I see your hand is up.
I'm thinking that this would be a really great time to show some models of what a 2-story structure really looks like from the next door backyard. So my concern about the 2 stories is, in my neighborhood, University Park, we went through a year-long rezoning to eliminate the possibility of the longhouse, the 2-story longhouse going all the way from the front to the back. So we basically preserved the Cookman's 2 longhouse solution of eliminating the 2-story option of the suburban house form and maintaining 1 story in the rear 35% of the lot. So when we're talking about 2 stories, the difference in 1 story is what, 17 feet? Is that 1 story height? I should know this. Sorry.
Currently, that's the garage allowance. So you're allowed to build a 1-story garage at 17 feet.
So if you're trying to preserve the intentions of Quick Wins 2, which is a sense of open space, privacy, solar access, you really want to stick to 1 story, correct?
Depending on context or the goal that we're trying to achieve, I think we really need to balance, housing as our citywide solution over preservation of sunlight in a lot of ways. I think this is a discussion that we need to have as a committee. What are the trade-offs here?
So this was in the urban edge district.
And it's, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Josh.
No, I think maybe Abe can talk a little bit more about the status of Quick Wins too. I mean, Rosemary, I know you bring this one up a lot, but we've had a lot of policy updates since then. And so our guidance is Blueprint Denver 2019. And so I'm not sure how Quick Wins, whatever year that was adopted or pursued, but maybe Abe, you can speak to that a little bit more.
It actually happened a little before the 2010 zoning code update. I'm sure Rosemary knows the exact year, but yeah, I mean, Rosemary, everything she says is accurate about like this idea that, especially in urban and urban edge context, you get this kind of lower scale belt to the backyards that people really appreciated. And so the bulk plane steps down for the primary structure to 1 story in the rear. And then, there's just a concern that like allowing taller detached accessory structures then just pops something back up again that's back there. And I think that, the basic idea of preserving that lower scale in the rear and kind of the backyard green belt is still a valid concept. And, I think we should keep on the table. On the other hand, as Josh said, we're trying to look at ways for housing options, remove barriers to ADUs. And so I think, our thought, I mean, certainly in urban, where the slide here says, like, let's just say that you don't actually have to do the funky 1.5 story thing, which is really just a smaller 2nd story, that's still consistent with the idea, because there's going to be a separation between the primary structure and this structure, which is going to allow there to be, a belt of unbuilt area in the back, even though the primary structure or the accessory structure might be a full 2 stories that's all the way in the rear. The
Thank you.
question, as Rosemary said, we're not sure what to do about urban edge. Some folks in the chat are saying well, they have all the same barriers there, so it should be 2 stories there too. But I think there's other perspectives.
I think in talking to people in my neighborhood, it's sort of like if height is increased, allowed, with ADUs, we could end up with what we call a segmented longhouse with an open space in the middle. So this is where it would be really great to actually see some models, because maybe it's not as much of an issue as we all have in our heads. So thanks, Abe.
Thanks. And looking at visuals and models, great idea. Ozzy, I see your hand has been up, and then Emily.
I don't have a position on whether suburban should be 1 story or 2 stories. I'm not representing a suburban neighborhood. It seems to me one of the big trade-offs is that if you limit it to 1 story, then it's not going to work for people to do an ADU over a garage. And I know that parking in garages are an important issue in many suburban contexts. So I would be interested in hearing the thoughts of people from the suburban districts about what that trade-off would represent for them.
Let's do this. Let's go to Emily, and then if there are folks in the suburban context who want to chime in response to Ozzy's question, please do so. Emily, go ahead.
Thank you. I would love to hear that feedback from his question as well. I just want to, I guess, reiterate from more of a community standpoint, because I'm more so here representing the community of East Colfax and North Aurora, even though this is Denver, but and so just from a housing standpoint, I just urge everyone to really consider from that perspective of creating more housing and more housing solutions, because we are 7.3 million houses short in the country. And that is extreme. And so we really are in such a housing crisis. So removing barriers and allowing for slightly larger living spaces just helps address that housing crisis. And so I just really urge people to also really think about folks that are desperately in need of homes that can't afford them, or just that this could be a really great housing solution if we remove those barriers while also still keeping intact the integrity of the home and the neighborhood. It's still very possible. But yeah, I hope that sunlight and privacy and things do take a little bit less of a precedent over the people and families that really do need homes and houses.
Thank you, Emily.
It's a great reminder.
Yeah.
Here's a quick example. Just in this model, the difference between a 2-story and a 1.5 story would be 7.5 feet roughly of building length. And so you see the rear portion of that ADU there, you'd be able to actually build that out. And so the question is really, how extreme is that? How different is that 2-story versus 1.5? And so here's one visual example. We can look closely at other contexts and see how that'll impact it in the future with a little bit more dimensionality, but just, the visual test. Does it feel bad?
Thanks. Sean, go ahead.
What I want to say is sort of in line with what a lot of people have already said, but I wanted to make sure that I was passing my agreement. The height restriction was a huge barrier for our project. In particular, the points that you're making, you end up being so limited with the living space that you're left with, which on a structure that is essentially a 2-story building, but because of the way that the rules are set up with the restrictions, you do sort of have to build a larger base to accommodate the living space so that it's accessible and it's comfortable, but it's an arbitrary sort of silly restriction. You end up having a wasted space on a structure that is there and looks like a two-story building. And so I think this is a really good change to make. I'm not sure about the suburban settings, but I do feel like people want to be really thoughtful for their neighbors and projects. So I think people also want their ADUs to sort of match their properties and the context of their neighborhoods, and people are sort of thoughtful about that. And we do have RNOs in place to sort of help regulate or create conversations in different settings about sort of what the vision of the neighborhood is supposed to be. So I think this is a good thing to change.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, there's a lot of this echoed in the chat. Renee's comment about tall garages are already built by right and add density and block sunlight. And she recommends two-story ADUs allowed in the back 1/3 and urban edge context, except where a lot is too small to provide setbacks. So anyway, some interesting discussion about ideas and nuance to make this workable.
Yeah, great thoughts. And I think touching on sort of that suburban idea, I think our staff's speculative approach has been that a two-story ADU maybe isn't really necessary in the suburban context. You know, the lot sizes are so big and it's going to cost more to build it. They typically already have garages. And so we're not expecting folks to have the need to try to park within one. There's not alley access. And so you can't necessarily get a vehicle back there. So we're assuming that one stories feasibly would be more of the product that gets built in those contexts anyway, but still assumptions.
Does anyone from the suburban context want to chime in on this before we move on to the next? I'm noting the time. Okay. Well, this is great discussion, and I think a lot of food for thought for the staff. Josh, are you ready to move on to the next?
Yeah, that was great.
Did
I'm
someone-
sorry.
Mary,
Oh,
I don't
Mary,
know how to raise my hand.
go ahead, do it.
Okay.
Thanks, Mary.
So I live in a suburban setting, but I think it's more important to have affordable housing. So if a two-story is going to solve that problem, then I think it's fine. I mean, I know there are people who live in my neighborhood who probably don't think the same way, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, and I think we'll look closely at that. So if a two-story is the product, then maybe the setbacks are greater. If it's a one-story, then the setbacks are smaller. So we can look at the nuance there and have a proportionality related to privacy trade-offs.
Yeah, this is great discussion. Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, all good thoughts.
Okay.
On to the next one. Bulk plane height. This one's one that we've heard a little bit about. It's a little bit more technical, and so I'm going to run through an example of what it really means. But we've heard from you guys, some of the committee, that the bulk plane, especially on narrow lots, so we're mostly thinking about really urban narrow lots here. The bulk plane really affects the livability, the square footage, the usable square footage on the second floor. The bulk plane starts at 10 feet, starts at your property line, slopes 45 degrees. And so once you have setbacks, that means that your side wall of your ADU can only max out at about 15 feet, best case scenario. And so you're trying to squeeze in 2 floors under that all the way up to 24. You often can't utilize the full square footage. We're essentially building it anyway, but not using that space. It makes more sense to fill in the envelope and just build it rather than try to jog around and complicate construction in a lot of ways. But it does produce that extremely low head height on 2 sides of the ADU, so where the bulk plane is interrupting the form. So we'll take a quick look at an example here, just a hypothetical. Let's just assume that this structure was maxed out to the bulk plane, right? So the bulk plane is limiting the actual shape here of the unit. This one works out because it's still under that 1.5 story limitation. So the square footage that actually isn't used doesn't count against you, and we get this form, but you get the idea that this looks like a 2-story building, right? Regardless. And so your floor ends up somewhere around here. If you're parking below, you're doing that building coverage exemption. You need to provide 80% of your ground floor with parking. We want to ask the question, how habitable is that space? How many grandmothers can you have over at the tea party in this space? Where does that habitable space actually end? And you can see here the head height gets pretty low once you start measuring against that floor. So we want to ask the question if we should modify the bulk plane, especially in some of our more urban context locations. We'll talk more about context, but if we were to raise the bulk plane 1 foot, 2 foot, does that move the needle? Does that open up a little bit more habitable space once we move to a 2-story structure? Are you allowed to actually fully use that second floor and get your full potential 650 square foot footprint as habitable space? So here's just a quick example of, this is what it used to be if we were to go this direction. If we were to allow 2 more feet on your side wall of your structure, that means you'd roughly end up with a 17-foot sidewall. We want to ask the question about impacts, shadows, if that really increases things, but we would not look at increasing the height of the overall structure. So it would shape the roof line a little bit differently, maybe a little bit of a flatter pitch roof. But if you look at those two side by side, here's the before on the left, the existing bulk plane restrictions, and then the after being that 2 feet in increased bulk plane height. So yeah, we'd like to open up this topic for discussion. Are there any blind spots that we're not thinking of? Would that warrant a change in the building height whatsoever? And along with that, should we also look at allowing dormers to pierce the bulk plane, which we know is of interest and has occurred in many of our overlay districts that allow that for ADUs.
And Josh, just for the less technical people, when you say dormers to pierce the bulk plane, it's the example that on the bottom right here.
Yeah, so there's a quick little graphic there. And so technically right now, you're not allowed to have any portion of your building pierce that bulk plane. And so it really does kind of form that typical roof line. There is some overlay districts where the character of the neighborhood sort of warranted that outcome. And so they've requested to allow those things to pierce through.
Thank you. Great. Well, I see Rosemary, you have your hand up, and I think this is really just an opening to respond to any of these questions or other thoughts. Rosemary and then Ozzy, go ahead.
Okay, it was suggested to me to consider having the bulk plane start at 15 feet and then allowing dormers, which are not currently allowed. Is that correct? To have the space feel more open. So
that is correct.
Can you do modeling of, is it easy for you to do simple modeling of that? It's similar to what you're showing here. It's just a little bit different.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we could certainly take a look at that. 15 feet would be, yeah, I mean, it's a 50% increase over what it is today. And so I like where your head's at.
Could you keep the height at 20 feet?
We could, but I think you're getting into the territory of a very low slope roof. At that point, it would be kind of a potentially an awkward shape, but it's, I mean, something we're happy to look at and see what that outcome would be.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's so, and just adding to that, I kind of wondered, like, obviously the bulk plane is a really technical concept, but they start at the property line. So if you said the starting height was 15 feet, at a 5-foot setback, the structure could actually have a 20-foot tall wall. So that's kind of why Josh is saying, like, if the height limit was 20 feet, that makes the bulk plane irrelevant. Then it doesn't actually do anything. It's the same as the height limit, but we can figure that out.
Thanks for the nuance. Ozzy, go ahead, and then Sarah.
Yeah. So I think the frustrations I hear from people building ADUs, the bulk plane is the thing that comes up most often. Especially on narrow lots where the consensus is that, it's just borderline impossible to make a livable ADU on a 25-foot wide lot with the current bulk plane. So it absolutely does need to be increased. I really like the idea of allowing dormers to pierce it too. As Gosha pointed out in the chat, they are an expensive thing, but allowing dormers to pierce the bulk plane allows for some more variety and interest in the massings of ADUs, which can't happen right now. When Baker was looking at a conservation overlay, we spent a lot of time staring at this and thinking about it. And looking at the examples in Curtis Park where they got rid of bulk plane altogether. And I think we went back and forth on it a lot. If I can, in Curtis Park, I think when they eliminated both the 2-story rule or the 1.5-story rule and the bulk plane, they're seeing a lot of ADUs that are just a plain box, like basically the proportions of a shoebox, which doesn't seem like a very satisfactory outcome. At the same time, you know, I'd be interested in hearing from Tara, who's doing the modular construction, and does just raising the bulk plane help with constructability, or do we need something like an elimination of the bulk plane to allow modular solutions to work? So I don't know, it's super complicated discussion. I love the starting point of at least increasing it and allowing dormers to pierce.
Great, thank you. Sarah.
So for a long time, I always thought, you know, having the bulk plane is a good thing to, you know, keep our height, you know, down and, you know, be able to build within that. Something that I've seen come up recently, and I don't think it's any sort of a change. I think it's just something that we've been seeing as far as like comments back from the city from SUDP for when you're trying to get a sewer permit for these, is that the ADU has to be a certain amount above the alley flow line. And this is, I have a project for permitting right now where we're really bumping into some issues with it because we're right up against that bulk plane, but we have to be high enough above the alley flow line. So I think that this is something that we need to look at too, as like this is a barrier with the bulk plane. So I don't know what the answer is. Is it just doing that? Like Rosemary said, you know, maybe it's just a higher sidewall height that would suffice. Or is it we keep the height limit of that 24 feet, but we remove the bulk plane altogether, like is in Curtis Park, which, you know, especially on those 25-foot lots, I think really does work.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And Tara, I assume you're following up with Ozzy's comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah,
we can.
You know, I think, well, Ozzy, it's possible I think we've all found to work within these limitations, but it's not ideal, and it's not ideal for prefabrication either. So actually, what Sarah just described, we've run into the same thing, which is kind of pressure from both the ground plane and the bulk plane, and the puzzle is so tight, and livability is the thing that gets sacrificed, is the struggle here. So you know, in this topic as well as the last, I think we should look at simplicity and decreasing regulation to the largest extent possible, to allow the most flexibility for the designers to do their jobs well. And we need, I mean, this is coming from a design professional, but we need to allow a little bit of room for our design professionals to propose not only the variety that Ozzy's talking about, but just places that are livable for people. So that's my wish.
That's great. And thanks. I mean, I think we've heard about a number of principles that are important to folks, but the idea of simplicity and decreasing amounts of complex regs is great to point out. Thank you. Other thoughts about the bulk plane piece?
Yeah, one other question about it was, if this needs to apply to larger lot sizes. You know, in Urban Edge, we sort of get to those wider lots to where the bulk plane becomes less of an issue, right? Once you're at like a 50-foot wide lot, it's not so much of a problem. So question of what's our contextual sort of approach here?
I actually, like, if I'm allowed to have an opinion, I kind of think like it actually, like, if the flexibility is most needed on the narrower lots where it really becomes constraining. Having it on the larger lots is potentially a good thing because it's basically saying you can have all the flexibility. You should just move the ADU away from the side of the lot as you can on a larger lot, or generally could.
Yeah, it helps with placement, moving it to the center of the lot. Yeah.
Any other comments, concerns about the bulk plan proposal? Hopefully this gives you all staff food for thought and things to work with to come up with something more detailed and fleshed out.
Definitely. Yeah. A lot of things to test or potential outcomes. So
Great.
it's great feedback.
Okay. I think probably we can go on to the next.
All right. Yeah. Next, we're looking at that building coverage exemption. So this is the rule that says you're allowed to exempt 50% of your accessory dwelling unit up to 500 square feet, but only when vehicular storage is included. So that means your ground floor consists of 80% parking. And we've heard from this committee very clearly that is an issue. We should certainly stop prioritizing vehicular storage over housing. That's in line with our citywide policies as well. We're here to create housing options, not parking options per se. We certainly don't see enough single-story ADUs built. As Renee mentioned, their product is mostly a one-story. It makes it difficult with the lot coverage issues. We know that that's a more affordable product, and so there's also better accessibility, some design things that go along with that we are in support of. And of course, the cost implications for having to build a two-story structure versus just a one-story structure on smaller lots can be extensive. And so we'd love to remove these barriers or look closely at this rule to see what's applied. We think this rule is basically a carryover from the old parking incentive. So back when, 1950s, was it 54? One of our early adoptions where we had to essentially incentivize folks to store their vehicles on their property. Since we don't have a parking requirement for single unit dwellings, we said, well, we can incentivize it by giving you, the 500 square feet essentially free from your lot coverage. So folks built garages. But we're looking closely at that. We just simply applied it to ADUs and didn't really think about it at the time in 2010. And now's our chance to rectify some of those missteps. So more single-story ADUs are wanted. Here's our chance to simply apply that same standard to an ADU. Just another visual of what that looks like. Here is that exemption gone after on this example. 80% of the ground floor must be used for vehicular storage, which in this example, 650 square foot footprint would only leave you with 130 square feet of potentially habitable space in that same structure. We'd much rather see the entire footprint be able to be habitable. And so the potential solution that we're looking at is we would love to extend this exemption to accessory dwelling units regardless of parking. So the exemption would still apply to garages, but it would also apply to a single-story ADU if you wanted to build that instead. We would not increase the maximum lot coverage, so there's still that proportionality involved where you can only build so much building on your property. We would just be simply extending the parking exemption rule to accessory dwelling units. Currently citywide, everyone's allowed 1,000 square foot, one-story, 17-foot tall garage. And here's just an example of an accessory dwelling unit having to go after that potential lot coverage exemption. So being forced essentially to add a garage, which who knows, may or may not be used for vehicular storage, but certainly increasing the cost of that product. And so we just want to check in with the committee and see if there's any blind spots that we're missing, or if we've heard anything incorrectly, or what other concerns you may have around extending this exemption to ADUs.
Thanks, Josh. I see some double thumbs up from Ozzy. A couple of you went off or onto video. I don't know if that means that you want to chime in on this idea. my sense is their support. Are there any concerns or red flags or nuances or exceptions or anything on people's minds about this?
I did have a question. This 10,000 foot garage that is allowed on people's property today, or not 10,000 feet, 1,000 feet footprint. Is there, you know how you build an addition on your house? Is there something in the code that would allow me to pop the top of the garage? Can you build it in phases to where you have the first floor and then when you get enough money, you come in and you put a second floor?
You would not be able to exceed the height limitation for a garage form, so it would be 17 feet. You could, in some ways, build it as an ADU, potentially use the accessory dwelling unit form, that height limitation, and yeah, I mean, potentially there's a way to phase it in. I'm not sure, but yeah, you would follow those standards. You would follow the 24-foot height limitation.
Darcy, does that answer your question or was it?
It does.
Okay. Does anyone else, I mean, this is another slightly technical thing. Does anyone else have just questions about this?
I think, whoops, I forgot to raise my hand.
Go ahead, Sarah, you're good.
I think Jeff Baker has a good question if that could kind of be addressed. Just talking about it, just Josh, so what would the rule be if ground level is an ADU to get the exemption?
It would be pretty similar to as written today. It's just the accessory dwelling unit building form is allowed to have 50% or up to 500 square feet exempt from the lot coverage.
So basically would just stay the same as it is currently written.
Yeah, we would modify the language that says vehicular storage being required to get that exemption.
Okay.
So we would strike that language as far as you don't need to put cars in the ADU.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, we could
what
look
that
at,
might change is like you have an existing garage and you're at the absolute maximum building coverage, even with the exemption. You couldn't convert it into an ADU because you can only get the exemption for parking of vehicles. But if that changed, you could just convert that existing garage into an ADU. Because otherwise right now, like you'd have to go up instead of out because you're out of building coverage.
Thanks, Abe. Any other questions or comments?
Yes, I want to understand clearly what Abe was saying. Are you saying that I can convert my 1,000 foot garage into an ADU?
Abe, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So the answer would depend a lot on the conditions of your particular lot and how much building coverage there is on the lot right now. I mean, unless we change the maximum size allowance for an ADU, there's a good chance that you couldn't actually convert an entire 1,000 square foot garage into an ADU. But definitely like allowing an ADU use to have the same exemption that vehicle parking has would make it easier. Not sure that it would make it completely possible in your particular situation. It depends on the lot size and a few other things.
yeah, it'd be possible to convert a portion of that building to an ADU. So if you're on the smallest lot size, that means you would be able to turn 650 square feet of 1,000 square foot garage into ADU by subdividing and keeping the other use square footage separate.
That still doesn't make sense. I mean, it makes sense to me and I understand, but it seems like that ought to be investigated and checked into, because if we can put a car and have more space for a car, why can't we allow more space for humans?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I think that's something that we're open to discussing. We're not sure if our 650 square foot limitation is fair and appropriate for those lot sizes.
Yeah, good point.
So it sounds, Darcy, like this is something that's going to be in the mix, considered by staff. Am I hearing you right? Yeah.
I hope so.
I see Jennifer, your hand went up. Go ahead.
I really just have a comment that it just seems super arbitrary to have a fixed size of garage that is frankly bigger than the footprint of my house that can just get dropped anywhere. When there's all this nuance around, 650 feet or whatever it is around ADUs, it just seems super arbitrary. That's all.
Yeah, I think it's, the idea that people feel more comfortable if there's those privacy issues. Someone's not living in the garage per se. I mean, you could be welding all night and causing a ruckus. I mean, my band's practicing till 2 a.m. in the garage, so. But yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's something that we as staff are interested in, but we haven't heard specifically that we need to increase some of the square footage limitations for ADUs, but I think it's on the table.
Great. And I see Rosemary's hand went up as well, maybe on this topic. Go ahead, Rosemary.
Yeah, I think I just have a question. So if you have just like a one-car garage, could you also build a one-story ADU next to it, depending on your lot size?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. You would be able to do so. Yeah, I mean, you have those other limitations as far as lot coverage, and so the exemption would, you are only allowed to take the exemption once, right? You're not allowed to write off 1,000 square feet. And so you kind of have to make that trade-off depending on how big your existing structures are. It's still proportionate to your 30%, 37% lot coverage. And so we're not increasing how much building you can put on any given lot.
Okay, so that's not under consideration, the change in lot coverage or open space, shall we say?
No, I think we've heard pretty clearly that permeable surface standards and open space is, important.
Yep, thanks.
And I don't know if it helps, but I think to Darcy's point, what we're interested in doing is leveling the playing field between cars and people. And so there are situations right now where you have an existing one-story garage, you actually could build another garage or significantly expand it, but couldn't build an ADU back there because you're out of building coverage and there's nowhere else to put things. And we want to make it so that if you could do something with a garage, you could do it as an ADU, basically, is where we're trying to go.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks for those thoughts.
There's one more, there's support for this in the chat and a note from Tara. Why not align footprint allowances for garages and ADUs to allow simple conversions later? Another nod maybe towards simplicity.
Yeah, I think it's something we're interested in. I mean, there's this idea that, an ADU should be subordinate and should be accessory to a primary structure. And so if we were to just kind of allow 1,000 square foot ADUs citywide as the base, you kind of get into that zone of when does it become not accessory? When does that use become greater than the primary use? Say your primary house is only 800 square feet. It becomes, just some nuance in there. And so I think we need to look closely at what that means, what our definition of accessory is, and if it's appropriate to expand or allow more.
Great. Okay, and thanks for everyone's comments, continuing comments in the chat. Well, to allow time for our last two items, one of which is reuse of existing structures that people were starting to talk about and setbacks, probably we should move on. You ready to do that, Josh?
Yeah, I think so. I think Ghosh has got a great point in the chat. The garages should also be subordinate. But yeah, let's look at the next one. All right, setbacks. This is a fun one. We want to talk a lot about this idea of privacy, sunlight, setbacks. So we're looking at, square footages, height allowances. Now let's talk about a little bit more about placement. Currently the setbacks are essentially the same citywide, a 5-foot rear setback with or without alleys, and a 5-foot side setback, except for the really smallest lots, which we talked a little bit about the bulk plane affecting that. You are allowed to go down to 3 feet on those, but that's a really tiny lot, 30 foot wide or less. We've heard pretty clearly, once again, from this committee that it is an issue in a lot of ways, this idea of privacy, especially in other contexts, especially when there's not alleys present. I think we need to look closely at what that means. We've also heard from the public survey the idea of privacy, sunlight access. But we've also heard, on the contrary, that how much privacy is different than what a large primary structure is providing. And so here's an example on the right of, 2 primary homes with, a little side patio, and there's windows, seemingly overlooking the potential privacy zone here of whatever's happening in the side yard. And so we want to ask the question about what's appropriate here and looking at it per context. We hear a lot of things about, new construction is built right on top of one another, and new construction doesn't allow for sunlight. That, the reality is we've gradually increased our setbacks throughout time. Fire code and allowances have changed that. I mean, there's many of our historic examples where gutters are overlapping and houses are almost literally on top of one another. But we do want to balance this concept of privacy, looking at specifically the suburban context where the alleys don't exist, or even in the urban edge context where they don't exist. But we do want to balance some of that construction feasibility and site constraints. As we know, our task here is to remove barriers to ADU construction. And so let's just think really clearly about those things. So here's one example, thinking specifically about the suburban context and what can be built there today. So primary structure is in the pink. It's a 20-foot setback from the rear. It can be 2.5 stories. A garage, similarly, the same allowance. We know, I think we've exhausted that allowance at this point, right? 5-foot setbacks from the rear, 17 feet tall. It actually has a 0 side setback, but the bulk plane does affect some of those height implications. And then here's just one example to throw out of a potential ADU setback in the suburban context. What if we looked at something like 7 feet? Sky view here, but now let's look at some of those human views from the backyard. And so this idea of privacy, what can be built today? So everything on the left is the existing standard. So a primary structure can be built up to 35 feet tall, but it would have to be set back 20 feet away from the rear. Potential ADU regulations today would allow for 5 feet. And so we want to look at what that means. How does that feel when it's a little bit different? 7 feel better? Does 3 feel better? We don't know, but is your privacy infringed upon more so than a primary structure? Let's compare that also to the garage example. So a garage would have a 5-foot rear setback. This can be built today, 0 side foot setback, but 17 feet tall. And so it does have similar implications as far as shadows and access to light. So we're looking for that balance between what an ADU allowance should be versus a garage and versus a primary. Here's all 3 combined. And this is with the ADU moving to 5 feet. So just a quick little run through. Here's 5, here's 7, here's 10. If you feel the difference. So we want to know how much of your privacy, changes, how much of that feels less intrusive than potentially this 35-foot tall primary structure. We think 7 feet feels comfortable for something like suburban. 7 feet is an appropriate distance for planting full life mature trees. It's kind of similar to our citywide growth policies. You're allowed to do a 7-foot tree lawn, which allows for a full mature tree to create privacy, create screening. And so if you were to have 2 ADUs across a property, you would have 14 feet of space between those 2 structures, which would allow for a 60-year lifespan of mature trees in a double tree lawn scenario. Are there any sort of blind spots or unintended consequences we're looking at here? Does a larger setback actually increase the feeling of privacy? Does that 5, 7, or 10 make a difference? Happy to go back and look at some of these examples, but we'd like to open up the conversation to hear what you guys think.
And as well, if people have questions to clarify what's being proposed or being thought of, please do not hesitate to ask questions. There's no dumb questions. And Abe put another additional question in the chat. Maybe we only need to increase the rear setback in suburban context if we don't reduce the overall height limit to 1 story. So that's another question, I think, for folks in suburban areas to weigh in on. Any comments, thoughts, questions? I see Councilwoman Black, your hand went up for a second. Ozzy, go ahead, Councilwoman Black.
Do you have an image showing what it looks like from above? I have a hard time with this picture. Is the man standing in someone's backyard or a side yard?
Yeah, he's in his own backyard, hopefully. I don't know whose yard he's in. Yeah,
Okay.
So yeah, we're looking from a backyard.
So the structures behind him are his backyard. They're behind his back fence.
Yeah, let's go back to, so you see it's 3 different properties, right? So he's here. We're looking from basically your patio. This is your house, Councilwoman Black. No, someone's house. And so there's 2 separate properties here. One neighbor's building their primary to the rear, or potentially a garage. The other neighbor's putting an ADU there instead. Does that make sense?
Yeah, can I see that other picture again? Did you email this to us or can you?
I can.
All right. I'm not sure this captures what I'm seeing that people are concerned about. So I'm gonna have to think about this, and it's your example. It shows something that is not all that common, which is a house in a cul-de-sac. But what's probably more common is just a house that's actually closer to a lot that mimics the other ones.
Yeah, it's just the idea of a house without an alley, being right up against your neighbor's property lines, or 2 neighbors essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm gonna think about that and talk to some of my people about that.
Thank you. Okay. And it looks like I see Rosemary's hands up, and Ozzy would like to talk about setbacks in the urban context, but maybe we can discuss first the suburban. Rosemary, go ahead and you can let us know what, yeah.
So I'd like to ask Josh, could you do the 5, 7, 10 again, so we can see what those look like?
Yeah, you ready? It's kind of like the eye exam. Better
Right.
now?
Okay.
Better now? So here's 7, back to 5, down to 7, all the way to 10.
Okay,
Back to
just,
7.
looking at this, I mean, my immediate impression is the key, that it's 1 story. That's why, it's less intrusive. How is it 24 feet tall?
No, so this is just looking at,
I mean, what's the height on it compared to the garage? Just
it's the same as a garage. So we're looking at a 17-foot
17
potential. The assumption of, what might actually be built in this context when it's not easily accessible by a vehicle, garage door, or anything like that. So yeah, there are some assumptions made here, and so we have to start somewhere.
Okay.
Mary, I see your hand is up, and Sean.
Okay, I just, living in a suburban area, I think going back to what Councilwoman Black said before, that if you have these mega mansions going up, they're going to be more intrusive than the ADU. And if our committee is trying to make this more affordable, And I don't see a difference really between 5, 7, and 10. It's the height that needs to be considered.
Thanks, Mary. Sean, please, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that the one story, seeing it as a one story makes it definitely seem less intrusive, but with the 2-story next to it. I remember from the images from the last meeting, I think that the 7-foot setback with the thought behind being able to put in foliage or landscape for privacy in the suburban settings seems like a really great idea, especially if we move forward with allowing people to build 2 stories that might be right up on the back of someone's suburban lot. I think that being able to place trees to regain your privacy in your yard, especially mature trees and them having the space seems like a great thought behind your neighbor being able to build 2 stories 7 feet from your backyard in that kind of setting.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Thanks, Sean. Donna is agreeing with you in the chat. Let's see, Councilwoman Black, I see your hand went back up. Go ahead.
I liked what Sean just said about he felt like 7 feet was big enough for a tree, and I understand where that came from, but if you had that structure 7 feet and then a fence and then another structure on the other side of the fence, a tree would actually have a very hard time growing. I know our tree lawns are not wide, but they get sunlight all day long. And this is something that would not get all that much sunlight. So I never thought about that, but that's something else that I think we should think about.
Yeah, I mean, there's low light species and things that are appropriate for less, but yeah, it depends on orientation a lot of ways. But a 14-foot gap, it's something that, yeah, we can look closely at our forestry standards again and confirm with them.
Well, yeah, but you're gonna have a fence there. And so if you plant, so trees need a lot of light. I'm not aware of any low light trees in Denver. They need a lot of TLC. And it would just be hard for a tree to grow in a place that had all that potential shade.
Yeah, definitely something to look at. And we can model some of those shadows and things as well.
Yeah, great. I mean, I think this is the kind of detail that the staff was hoping to hear from you all, to be able to go back and really do a deeper dive into it. Any other thoughts on setbacks or questions? Ozzy, I know we wanted to turn to you on the urban front for a minute, but yeah, Darcy, go ahead.
Well, my question is, it takes approximately 10 years for a tree to reach any kind of maturity and height. Are they now selling full-grown mature trees that we would plant?
Depends on your budget, I think. Yeah, you can get some very big mature trees, but yeah, of course, there's feasibility around it. And I think it's more the idea of what's the goal here? What's the priority? Is it housing people, or is it planting mature trees for privacy? And so we need to think about these trade-offs. But
I did mean like foliage or landscaping in general, whether they were trees or not. I thought that the 7-foot setback, the way that Josh explained it, would give the option to put in some sort of landscaping privacy, that especially in a suburban setting, because the way that the yards were set up, it just seemed like it just felt intrusive from the other images, that you might have a home that close to you overlooking into your yard. But if you have the space to implement or to put in some sort of landscaping that could give either side, both sides, the opportunity to regain privacy, that seemed like a solid solution, especially if all the ADUs across the city adopt a 2-story standard. It seemed like the space seems like a good idea, but.
Yeah, and there's other planting. I mean, shrubs, shrubberies. There's other things that could be in place besides a mature tree that provide privacy and cover, etc.
Darcy, I think your hand might still be up from before. Ozzy, I know you wanted to say something briefly about the urban context before we move on to the next topic, our last one.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So in the urban districts, I would like us to consider reducing the side setbacks, especially on the lots where there are 5-foot side setbacks. It's like to get a certain size ADU, the farther you've got setbacks in from the sides, then the further it has to push into the backyard. And so the side setbacks are kind of forcing us to destroy usable backyards so that we can, get a usable ADU. And that 5-foot zone at the side is really not very useful. It is definitely not sufficient for any kind of gardening or plant life. It's too shaded for that. It's nice for rolling your trash back to the alley, but 3 feet is enough for that. And I was interested, I was looking at the code in Boulder, and they actually allow a 0-foot side setback for an ADU so long as you have an easement from your neighbor allowing you access to maintain the wall of your ADU. And I don't know if Denver would feel like that was too complicated, but I think that's a great solution where, if you have cooperation between neighbors and mutual support between neighbors, you could actually get people building side-by-side structures. I know 2 people in the neighborhood here who want to build an ADU and a garage butted up against each other because it's much more practical and it actually saves them building a wall. And they're going to go through years of hassle in terms of getting the variances for that. So I hope there's room for that conversation to reduce those restrictions for the U zones.
Thanks, Ozzy. Josh, you want to say anything about that before? I know we need to get to reuse of existing structures, but any final comments there?
No, yeah, I think that's great. I'd love to hear if anyone else has reservations about that, reducing that setback, specifically for urban contexts where appropriate.
Okay, so feel free if others want to put thoughts in the chat. Rosemary, I see yours. And I think with that, we'll move us to the last topic, just so we have enough time for it. Josh, although now you have to speed forward.
No worries, yeah. So the last one we have is looking at the reuse of existing structures. So we've heard very clearly from the public, through the survey results and from the committee as well. There's a lot of interest in reusing the building that already exists. It feels like the right thing to do, a sustainable thing to do where feasible. There's, of course, other restrictions like building code requirements around that. And so it's not necessarily an easy thing to do to convert a structure, but we do currently have restrictions through zoning that don't allow that to happen. So if, perhaps your garage doesn't meet the 5-foot setback requirements, you're not allowed to reuse any portion of that structure, unfortunately. But we do need to think about this idea of balancing privacy, but also cost, and this idea that we would not allow an increase in nonconformity. So you couldn't expand something that doesn't meet the code today, but we should allow them where feasible. We'd love to get the zoning out of the way. We'd love to remove that barrier that does exist. And so looking at the example of this, cute little red garage, unfortunately, like its neighbor, the idea being here that there was potentially a similar garage where the new gray ADU is, but they had to go ahead and demolish their cute little gray garage in order to be able to put up this structure because it potentially didn't meet those setback requirements. It was a 0 setback on the alley. And so we want to ask the question, should something like this be able to be expanded upon? Could the potential outcome, be much better if you were able to add on to that structure, but as long as what you added didn't increase any nonconformity? So that means the new addition would have to follow all the existing rules. So that new portion would have to be set back. And so you could potentially, squeeze in a little entrance door here if it did meet that 5-foot setback, and the remainder of your existing structure would, of course, meet all of the bulk plane height setback standards to go along with it. So the potential outcome we would be looking at is allowing that structure to exist, to be used as such. We would be balancing this idea of cost and reuse. The new ADU would meet the form standards. So we're not expanding your current allowance. We're just allowing you to use what already exists today. Are there any privacy concerns to contend with here? Would this, become an issue bother some of the neighbor, or are there any other blind spots, unintended consequences that we're not potentially considering?
Great. What are people's thoughts on this one? And I appreciate, by the way, the thoughts in the chat, just responding to Ozzy's point. But in terms of reuse of existing structures, does this seem like a good balance? Any concerns you would have or red flags? Ozzy, I see your hand is up. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's technically challenging to convert a garage to an ADU, but it is doable in some cases. I would love to see that become easier because there are zoning hurdles to it. I think as long as garages have more lenient rules than ADUs, I think the one thing you would need to watch out for would be somebody building a garage to take advantage of garage zoning and then coming back a year later and being like, whoops, we're going to make it an ADU now. So you might need some sort of date of establishment involved with it. Or like people in the chat are suggesting, maybe we just need the same rules for garages and ADUs, which I can see some sense in that for everyone's behalf.
Thanks. Councilwoman Black, go ahead. And then Darcy, I think you're next.
I agree. It's always better to reuse a building than to tear it down and build a new one. But what Ozzy said about the difficulties in converting, because garages aren't usually structurally strong enough to convert and to add a second story, plus they don't have any plumbing or electricity underneath the pad. But in my district, we have one application for an ADU in University Hills, and they do want to put it on an existing garage, which is a detached garage on a corner lot. And this is one that it seems like a really good idea to me, but I can see some of the same questions that people are upset about is the privacy. So their garage that these people have right now is 5 feet from the neighbors, and they don't want a second story above it. So I like the idea, but I've got people in my district who are gonna have some issues with it. So I again need to think about that some more.
Yeah, so the upper stories would have to follow the setback requirement. So you wouldn't be able to extend that if it's like, say, a 0 setback garage or whatever it might be, whatever we land on for the appropriate setback for suburban. You would have to follow those new rules. So you can't continue the existing structure in place without following the new rules for the addition. Does that make sense?
Well, not really. I mean, this one in where they have the application, it's 5 feet from the fence.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we settled on a 7-foot setback, but then we say you can use the existing garage, then they are going to get it. And
yeah, the upper story would have to be 7 feet. So you would have a 2 foot, little roof pitch difference. The lower floor can remain, but the upper floor would have to be 7 feet away.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks for the questions and clarification. Darcy, go ahead.
So one of the things we had in our neighborhood, we had some concerns about the differences between the right up to the end of the property line where these properties have existed for a very long time. And then we have the other properties with the setback like that. And there was a concern for safety walking up and down the garage or the alley because you couldn't really, there were hiding spots. So it didn't seem to be a safe environment for a lot of people. However, because of what we're trying to achieve here, which is making housing available for more people, making it more cost effective, using the existing garages are, to me, the way to go. And then not only that, to Councilwoman Black point, we have engineers that have the ability and contractors that have the ability to reinforce those bearing walls or making bearing walls in order for them to pop the top. And with an engineer, they can come in and structurally design it to where you would be able to build and use that as the second story or build on top of one. But that would be the engineer's risk.
Thanks, Darcy, for those comments. Donna, go ahead. Your hand is up.
Yeah, so, and I don't know how Councilor Black's district looks. I don't know if they have alleyways or not, but, you know, I think this kind of lends to the idea that this can't be a one size fits all. So what might work in a more urban context with alleyways may not work in her district. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I can see the argument for having 10-foot setbacks, like we were talking about on the last slide before. I do think that, as Sean said, you know, hedging, you know, I'm thinking lilac, stuff like that, those can get pretty tall. So there are workarounds to that if we settled on the 7 foot. But I do think, you know, I love the idea of lifting that alleyway setback and maybe even incentivize if you can reuse a structure. Maybe there's some workaround with how to fortify it. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of some way to incentivize not sending things to landfills. Maybe we can, you know, a Habitat for Humanity type of deal. That's great. You know, we can send it to their warehouse, but I think we all know that most construction debris goes to landfills. So that's all I have.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think, you know, in the final report that staff is preparing for council, I know that they're going to be drawing on these meeting discussions. And it seems like some of these ancillary goals, in addition to making housing more available and more cost effective, is, you know, things like all of the equity considerations that have been raised in this process, but also things like reducing materials going to landfills and things like that, sustainability in general. So anyway, thanks everybody for those comments. Others on reuse?
Yeah, I was just curious if there's anyone we haven't heard from tonight at all.
I'm looking around. I think this would also be a good point if you haven't spoken up tonight and you have thoughts on anything that we have just been talking about for the last hour plus, to just chime in. I think we can open it up for a couple of minutes, especially if you haven't had a chance yet tonight.
Yeah, some of these topics got a little technical and into some weeds, but hopefully everyone was able to follow along.
Okay, great. And we also are going to be looking at the chat. And so, you know, if something's in the chat, but it wasn't said verbally, don't worry, we'll be taking a look at it. I know that we wanted to leave the last, 5 minutes of our discussion before public comment, if anyone has any public comments, to talk about what comes next, Josh, and focus groups that the city's convening. So I think we can transition to that.
Yeah, certainly. Let me sorry, I was digging into some of the chat windows. But yeah, I think Abe was going to give us a quick recap.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for remembering to do that, Abe. That's great.
Yeah, do you think we have time for real quick?
Maybe if you try to do it in like a minute.
Okay.
1 to 2 max. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
So really appreciate the great discussion. Clearly, we need to do more investigating. We need to illustrate some things and provide some answers. We just wanted to kind of look at where are we pretty close? Where do we really need to do some more work? Are there any major roadblocks? I kind of color coded these things a little bit. Like the one thing where I just thought like, yeah, we're really quite close / there, at least in terms of this committee is the minimum lot size. Most of the other stuff, like I actually think like it feels like there's some real merit, and we just need to have a little bit more discussion and to bring the committee a little bit, some more materials. And there's discussion, as you see here, about like there being a little bit more nuance between the different contexts in some cases, and then also wanting to talk about being more flexible about some of the things that we didn't really propose to be more flexible about. And everything, kind of has a domino effect on everything else. So like, for example, if we were to get a lot more flexible about just the minimum setbacks, like not having one on the side, say in urban, or a very modest one, maybe we wouldn't need to think so much about the reuse of existing structures, because that would just allow them to be, they just meet the base standards anyway. But otherwise, I think like reuse of existing structures is one where like, yes, as long as, if you need it in order to convert something, we should have something like that available. And yeah, I think it's probably the main takeaways is really just looking at, we just need to investigate more things about like greater flexibility on narrow lots and in special conditions and in different contexts. But overall, there wasn't anything that we talked about where I, felt like I heard like, that's a terrible idea. So I think we're, it's going well. And we have a few more things to talk about next time, of course, in addition to continuing this discussion.
Thanks, Abe. That is so helpful. Thanks for doing that. And Michelle, I saw your hand go up. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is probably just a setup for a longer conversation, either offline or at the next meeting. But, I've just been always curious about the foundation. So thanks everyone for kind of some of the chat stuff. But when I think about the conversation that we just had about reusing an existing garage, can that even be really reused and built on if the foundation doesn't work? That scenario was very cool with the little red garage and the setback and the second story, but is that even feasible because of the foundation? I mean, I like the idea of the sustainability and reusing, but now that I'm kind of listening and learning a little bit more about foundation stuff, I just have a lot of questions on that piece.
And
Yeah.
because that was such a big part of the chat, I just wonder if we can somehow work that into the next meeting, Josh, just for the sake of time right now. But it does seem like there's a lot of interest and comments about that. Gabe, I also see your hand just went up. Go ahead.
So someone in our area has a old garage, and they seem to think that it was built at some time, I don't know, after World War II or before World War II. And they said it's just like a bomb shelter. I mean, it's the foundation on it is just huge. And I think in the urban area, some of these old garages are built a lot more sturdier than, say, the newer structures. So I think that has to be kept in mind too, because yes, maybe the monolithic slab on the new garages may not hold a foundation, but some of the old structures really are built. So just to keep that in mind as well.
Thank you. That's great. Okay, well, we will come back to this particular one, this last piece for sure. But Josh, why don't you take us through what happens next?
Yeah, so thanks, guys. This is a lot of good input. We are looking at actually pushing out the July meeting. So not holding an advisory committee meeting. It is a kind of compressed timeline with this meeting being a week back and 4th of July holiday and things like that. And so you've given us so much good info, and it sounds like I have a lot of homework and modeling to do. So we'd love to prepare fully for the August meeting. So looking at taking a break for July. Well, not necessarily a break. I'm going to be busy, but we want to make sure that we're clear and that's okay with you guys. It's not going to conflict with many schedules, but we think we can start to combine some of the alternatives and recommended strategies in the next meeting. But we will have time for public outreach meeting to occur sometime in July. We're also looking at moving the focus groups to more of a rolling focus group discussion. And so we have set up a suburban focus group meeting for next week. In fact, we've got about 8 to 12 folks on the line already. And so we are keeping that smaller and invite only. A couple of committee members will be in attendance. And so we will be reporting back with that information. But as you've discovered tonight, there's a lot of nuance there with suburban concerns. And so there's a few more things that I think we need to hash through. We're also looking at setting up the AIA architecture focus group. I think we got into some of those technical details tonight about, what should the bulk plane really do, right? Should it be 2 feet? Should it go away? And so we'd love to have that conversation with a lot more design professionals in mind and see what's feasibly going to be the best outcome. So we are planning to hold that one in July as well. And if there's any other focus groups that warrant anything in the meantime, feel free to reach out and let us know. But we're thinking that these two are becoming the priority right now in the coming months. So yeah, thinking about that next meeting, we're looking at holding it the first week of August 4th, same time, Thursday, 4:30. So mark that on your calendar. Take a little break for July, if you will. But yeah, we'll start to look at really diving into some of those solutions. It sounds like we've got a lot of modeling nuance to look at, a lot more examples, and maybe come back with a little bit more concrete proposals, really tie down some feet to some of these numbers, some dimensions and things like that. But in the meantime, we're always available. I mean, I'm always reachable by email and happy to discuss and willing to meet if we think something needs a closer look, maybe even do some office hours in the month of July. So let me know what you guys think and what you feel is appropriate, but I'm open to suggestions. But that's all we have for this meeting. I think, do anybody have any feedback on the movement of the timeline or the potential process moving forward?
I wanted to ask Josh, at this early on, you had like 3 topics that we aren't really addressing or taking on right now. Are those topics we're going to circle back around to at some point, or are you feeling like they aren't urgent? Or
Yeah. So those are set up to be discussed at the next meeting. And so some of the concepts that we talked about today, helps feed our sort of recommendations and helps inform the direction of those topics. So yeah, the idea of owner occupancy, higher intensity zone districts and things like that. Yeah, they are on our list to tackle the next meeting.
Rosemary, go ahead.
Josh and Abe, could we also keep alive the idea of allowing historically designated houses to have ADUs where they're currently not allowed? I just want to see this possibility continue in the group.
Yeah,
yes,
definitely.
And we want to keep talking to you and potentially have some separate group meetings with preservation experts and specialists and advocates just to, see how much they think that could accomplish.
That's great. I'm talking to Annie next week, so.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, we have run it by some of our internal landmark staff. And so, yeah, there is interest in evolving that discussion. So thanks for that.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Rosemary. So before we wrap up here, I wanted to see if anyone in the public audience, I think there aren't too many people, but if anyone has a comment that you haven't addressed already in the Q&A, please go ahead and put your hand up and we'll call on you. And otherwise, we are going to wrap up. Okay, I am not seeing any hands. Great. So with that, any final comments? Thanks for the great chat, everybody. Abe mentioned a picture that Jeff Baker, who's in the audience, sent of a recent accessory structure conversion to ADU. I don't see it. I don't think we're able to see it in the chat stream. At least I can't.
No, sorry. I see it as
no worries.
garage conversion in there, like right
Oh,
after,
interesting.
well, right before Rosemary's
Huh.
comment on the AIA, but
Oh,
we'll-
yep,
we'll-
it's further up. It's
Okay.
right there. Yep. And we'll include that in materials along with the public Q&A and the anything else. So thank you everybody so much. We will see everyone as a group in early August, some of you in focus groups. And in the meantime, have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, thanks a bunch.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Take care, everybody. Good night.
Yeah.
Good night. Good night.